Brilliant. So now we're going to move into the Temporary Works Q&A panel. Delighted to be joined by a wide range of different experts in temporary works. And yeah, I'd just like to, some of whom have spoken as part of the webinar series, some of whom have chipped in with questions and helped us out during those during the sessions, even if they haven't been delivering a specific presentation. So I just want to welcome you all to the Q&A and just start by getting you all to just give us a quick introduction to who you are and what your main role within Temporary Works is. So if we could start with you, David.
Thank you. Yes, David Thomas, these days Director of the Temporary Works Forum and Company Secretary, a role that takes 3 days a week for me. I'm a civil engineer with about 15 years or so in engineering and management consultancy before spending 10 years at the Health and Safety Executive, ending up as a Principal Specialist Inspector of Construction. And then I went back into industry as a safety director at William Hare. Did a little diversion here and there, but I nowadays run the Temporary Works Forum and do a little bit of freelance work, primarily related to temporary works management and work at height.
Fantastic, thanks, David. Ray, could you introduce yourself for us, please?
Morning, I'm Ray Filip. I'm a temporary works consultant. I've been in temporary works for about 33 years, principally with tier 1 contractors, Langs and Kiers. My own business for the last 14 years now. Surprisingly, this is the first year since 1990 that I am doing no temporary works designs. And I'm very happy about that.
Malachy, could you introduce yourself, please?
Hi, thanks, Christian. My name is Malachy Ryan. I'm Managing Director of Allen White Design. We are a civil engineering consultancy and our specialist areas are access engineering and temporary works. I'm also Director of the Temporary Works Forum. I don't have as many years in the industry as some of the other guys, but I've about 10 or 11 years in temporary works and 4 years on the dark side, which is permanent works, prior to going into the temporary industry. So thank you.
And Steve.
Hi, I'm Steve Williams. I'm the Technical Head of Discipline for Network Rail. Was IP ceases to exist on Monday. It's now going to be Capital Delivery. And I've about 35 years in the game now. I don't know where the time's gone, by the way. I'm a fellow of the Institution of Structural Engineers and a fellow of the Institution of Civil Engineers. I've had 20 years in consultancy, but also novated to contractors and working with contractors intimately on many jobs. I first became involved in the railway about a year after the original privatisation. And I've been with Network Rail for 11 years doing an assurance role, looking at permanent works designs and temporary work design and how the two merge.
Fantastic. And finally, the man that needs no introduction. So people have been on these webinars. But Angus, could you just tell us a bit more about your role and history and round it off for me?
Yeah, thank you for that introduction, Christian. I appreciate that a great deal. For those of you that have watched a few of these, you'll know that Christian likes nothing better than winding me up, as does Malachy. So
it's the Angus
Solters. I'm the Managing Director of Andun, and I've been with Andun since I think 2011. It was my father's business, and I've learnt a lot from him over the years. And we now specialise in the temporary works and the demolition side of things. I think that's probably enough about me. So
fantastic. So we've actually had a question. It was one we had on our prepared list, but it's actually come in from a member of the audience as well. So Taryn Atwell asks, how involved should a principal designer be when dealing with temporary works? What are the expectations? Anyone particularly want to raise their hand and take this one? Or I'll fire it over to someone. Dave?
Well, I'll kick off. I mean, the principal designer is there to plan, manage, monitor and coordinate the works. So it's a fairly hands-on sort of proactive role in my view, but it's also one with temporary works design that carries on during the construction phase. There's this wonderful little quirk that I might call it in CDM, where you know, the pre-construction carries on during the construction phase, and a lot of temporary works design is therefore undertaken during the construction phase. So it's, in my opinion, it's quite an onerous role. It's certainly a step up from the planning supervisor through to then became the CDM coordinator to what we have now. And if I can fly a flag for the Temporary Works Forum, go and have a look at the free information sheet that attempts to give some interpretation of the CDM regulations in terms of the principal designer role and temporary works. I don't know whether that starts off the debate, but it's a role that appears to me to be, in terms of temporary works and the feedback that I get from members, to be poorly applied in terms of temporary works design. But maybe others might want to comment on that.
Yeah, I might jump in if you don't mind. We do a lot of work on buildings, and typically the principal designer on those projects would either be the consulting engineer in the permanent works, or maybe a contracted principal designer. And in our experience, we've rarely been involved with that person. We've managed the projects ourselves, dealt with the risks, passed them onto the residual risks onto the contractor. And I've rarely been involved with the principal designer on these items.
So one of the principles, if you look at some of the guidance, is that as you move from design into construction, traditionally, you'd think that the planning supervisor would have everything sorted out. However, as soon as any design is done during construction, which is on a simple job where temporary works comes in, then the planning supervisor has absolutely got a role. So there's this massive overlap. And there is a perception in the industry that it's like this. Well, it's actually a massive overlap. And so I absolutely think it's fundamental for the planning supervisor to have a full understanding of not just what is designed in terms of permanent works, but also temporary works and how the two things interface. And on our jobs, we use ECI, early contractor involvement, and we have a clear understanding that our supply chain will be doing coordination throughout the project because it actually adds value. And I've got numerous examples where our permanent works designs have had to change as a consequence of dealing with constructability and temporary works. And had we thought about those things earlier, we would have saved a shed load of money. End of. So to me, the principal designer role is an important and perhaps underutilized resource that will help efficiency moving forward. Does that help?
I think I disagree with that. The only thing from my experience is that I think a lot of temporary works problems originate from the fact that they're not identified early enough in the whole process. They're very much an afterthought. And for me, the role of the principal is to try and make sure it's not an afterthought, that it's thought about right from the concept of the project.
Yeah, I think I agree with everything that's been said. The only thing I'd add is that from my point of view, getting involved with demolition, I'd like to see principal designers doing what they're supposed to, which is coordinating information a lot better and making sure that the information is available to the right people at the right time. That's the point they seem to miss regularly. And from my experience, apart from one project, they tend to spend their time shuffling big spreadsheets around with a load of risks on them, a lot of which are standard risks that we all understand, like working at height. So I think there's definitely things that need to change, and the role needs to be what it's supposed to be in the regulations, really, rather than just a paper shuffler as I see him at the moment.
I've also heard some principal designers assume that they have to design temporary works themselves. I think maybe all of us on the panel would agree they're probably the last people we want to design our temporary works for.
Yes.
That's what we do, isn't it?
Yes. Yeah.
Although, of course, they do have to be a designer. according to the regulations. So it doesn't say what sort of designer, but a principal designer has to be a designer. So, but yeah, they're not there to design in the sense, in the sense.
They may not have the skills, the competency to design a scaffold. But I think there are to make sure there is sufficient room on the project to build a scaffold if we have to.
Yeah.
I think there are occasions, again, I suppose I picked this up through members, but where the principal designer themselves are not appointed early enough. So I sense that might still be an issue. I pick up the comments that when somebody's pricing to be a principal designer on a job, that somebody's really thought about it. They've got some idea of what Temporary Works is likely to be involved in the thing that hasn't yet been designed. They're trying to put a price in, and yet somebody else just goes in on a very simple basis. And if they've got a cheap price, you probably get a shoddy product, and
full of caveats.
Yeah, and the shuffling of spreadsheets. I think information is key. Persuading clients that they should be forking out to pre-construction information includes surveys. So if it means spending money on surveys, then that's what a client should be doing, because the law requires it. So I think there's some way to go there. And in some senses, I get very, very frustrated. I've been working with CDM for over 25 years now. And in many respects, I'm not wholly convinced that we of the industry have improved. I think we're in Temporary Works, or generally, a very fragmented industry with lots of interfaces. I think we're very contract driven, perhaps a bit adversarial at times, despite all the reports about team working. It was at Egan and Latham and all that stuff. So I get very frustrated, and particularly obviously when I was in my enforcement days, attending incidents, lots of fatalities, sadly.
Okay, so the next question I'm going to hit on, I'm going to hand this over to Ray, unless he wants to pass it on, is can the DI delegate his works to senior TWCs?
When you say delegate their work, what do they mean by delegate their work?
Fortunately, they've
that's it. Okay.
Yeah.
I suppose the role of the DI is like the buck stops with them with regard to Temporary Works. So they ensure the organisation has a procedure. The procedure gets updated on a regular basis. You distribute the procedure, and if required, you put in some sort of audit process for it. It doesn't, however, mean necessarily that the DI has to do all of that themselves. So it's not unusual for the DI to, we expect it to be a fairly senior person in the company. They may have somebody sort of working for them that does sort of the spade work, if you wish to call it that sort of thing. But I don't sort of necessarily like using the word figurehead, but it's somebody who, the buck has to stop with that person with regard to Temporary Works. So they have the overall responsibility for Temporary Works. Doesn't mean they have to do all of the jobs themselves. I suppose a similar analogy would be, I suppose most companies would have a health and safety director, or all companies will have a health and safety director. It doesn't mean the director responsible for health and safety goes round the sites and forces people to put harnesses on and put up edge protection and make sure all the ladders are checked. They're there to control the policy, the culture of health and safety within that organisation.
Thanks.
Panels sort of vaguely agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, I've come across one or two instances where the designated individual was actually a board director, and in effect that in one case the board director had appointed what was loosely being nicknamed the DI's agent. In other words, the right-hand person who was going to be doing the legwork on a day-to-day basis. So I suppose it's the difference between responsibility and accountability.
Yeah.
Ultimately, the buck still stops with the person right at the top, and it's them that signs off the policy. So,
I think it's the same with health and safety, environment, quality,
And with everything.
all of those sort of policies and procedures that organisations have. There's somebody at the top, and the buck stops with them.
Health and Safety at Work Act 1974.
Yeah.
Ray, I've experienced a contractor who had outsourced their DI role to a consultancy. I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
I would ask why the consultancy would want to take on that role in the first place.
Yeah.
Why would you want to manage somebody else's procedures for them? It's not unusual for people to employ consultants like me to advise and help them to write the policies and make sure you've got all the forms and everything in place. I wouldn't take on the role of DI for somebody.
I'm not a lawyer, but isn't there something about the fact that you can delegate responsibility, but you can't delegate accountability?
I think as well, the DI role, it's an ongoing thing. It's no good just writing the procedures, setting everything up and letting the ball roll. For me, that the DI, there's the competence element of checking individuals and that they're competent. And if you're from an outside organisation, do you really know those individuals that you're trying to tick off in inverted commas? How are you going to, who's going to monitor that what you planned is what's actually being implemented? So I think I'd be slightly nervous about outsourcing it, but then I don't think, and I'll maybe look to Ray here, I don't think 5975 tries to be that prescriptive. Ultimately, it's about how you manage your work safely.
I would just, so I would question why somebody would want to. I suppose there's a financial.
Yeah.
Everyone wants to earn a living, but why would you necessarily want to manage somebody else's procedures for them? It would make me nervous.
Brilliant. So the next question we've got is from Ashley Best. I'm just going to see if we can bring Ashley in to answer that or ask that question themselves. If you're there, Ashley, please unmute yourself. If not, hi Ashley, how you doing?
Are you all right?
Yeah, good. What's your question for the panel?
No, it's not a question as such. It's more of a statement. I think there's a lot more frameworks happening nowadays, like Escape and others, which is giving more opportunity for ECI involvement in particular. So from a temporary works engineer's point of view, like myself, I get involved with Atkins and the likes a lot more at early stages at concept, which I can discuss temporary works and issues of buildability. And I think finally a lot of the clients are seeing benefit of this now. So I say it's not a question, it's more of a statement. And I do think frameworks are a good way forward, to be honest.
Happy days. Do you want me to say anything on that?
No, not really. No, it's just a comment, really. Not what everyone's thoughts on it was.
You're bob on, mate. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah. The earlier the better, from my point of view. The earlier we can get involved with the project, the better the outcome for everybody. You can save a lot of temporary works if you get involved at the right time.
We had one job in particular in Middlesbrough, and it was a central pier in a dock, and we couldn't build it basically, full stop. And we basically ended up redesigning it with precast, which made the job buildable. But 21 on paper from permanent works design, there's a lot of CAD technicians draw stuff and it all looks good and pretty. But then as soon as you come to build it on site, you're stuck at stop one really. But that's where the ECI is good, I think.
Yeah. So there is nothing better than getting a bunch of experienced but diverse people around the table to troubleshoot where things might be going early doors, because you'll be surprised on how you can be focusing down the right road rather than going in a completely different direction and spending thousands and thousands of pounds doing what you think is the fantastic thing. Whereas if you'd thought about it a bit, you'd have done something completely different.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah, I think on a lot of projects we work on now, we sit down with the contractors we have close relationships with, and we help them out with their tender. And I know Angus does a lot of that as well. And you're highlighting the temporary works. You're almost creating a tender temporary works register, and highlighting all the risks for, obviously pricing it, but also the challenges or the questions that need to be put back to the design team as to how does this proposal going to work.
No, thanks, Ash. That's it's good to have the panel all in agreement. So with that, I think I'm going to take a step into the controversial side, and I'm gonna start by saying permanent works. How do you think that temporary works and permanent works can? How can we, as an industry, make that a more smooth transition? Given moving on from Ashley's point, I'm going to throw to you, Angus, to start, and then let the carnage ensue.
There's no
is there a bleep facility on this somewhere?
It's just not child friendly, Ray. You can swear if you want.
Yeah.
Don't start me off.
There's no permanent works designers here to defend themselves, so it's even easier. I'm
one.
Well, okay. Yeah. I would say that getting people involved earlier who know temporary works and know who to construct things is the key thing. Now that brings a lot of contractual issues and also cost issues. I mean, if you're a permanent works designer, are you really going to look to bring in a temporary works designer unless there's a budget for it that someone is paying for? Because let's face it, we're not going to work for free. That's not how business works. Now the framework side of things can assist on that, but it's still getting this step change, or you got to start upskilling permanent works designers to understand how things are built. That's the other option. I think I'll throw it over to someone else now. I didn't do.
I was going to say, I certainly think there's a willingness. Maybe we are starting to see a culture change within permanent works designers, where they are. So my feeling is they genuinely are taking more of an interest in temporary works. Maybe partly because you could argue, well, CDM are sort of they've got their sort of arm up their back and somebody's twisting their arm about it. But I think genuinely, I've certainly noticed in recent years there is more willingness for them to learn about temporary works and take an active involvement in it. It's slow. I'm not saying we're anywhere near there, but it is starting to change.
Yeah, I'd agree with Ray there. Back in my permanent works days 11 years ago, it was a case of temporary works contractors problem. We're not looking at it at all. Nowadays, we do get involved with consultants that would ask us maybe to do a buildability review or constructability review of the project, particularly in basements. I think there's probably a lack of knowledge in basement sequencing and construction. But I think they're getting better than they were in the past. And then you have other consultancies who do the temporary works and the permanent works. They're the guys who steal all our fees, So they do have a decent knowledge of it, and they can capture a lot of the temporary works issues, hopefully, by tweaking the permanent works, to work better for the contractor to build.
I'd add that ever since I was a pup, I've been taught by people that you have to think when you're designing something of how you're going to build it, and you've got to come up with at least one workable sequence in which you can build what you're designing. And it's fine for somebody to come along and change how that might be done, but if you haven't thought of the one way of doing it, you haven't really done your job as a designer. And I had it drilled into me from an early age that we need to sequence how things are going to be built with the perception of the designer, so that then the contractor might be able to add value, or indeed with the benefit of working together over a long period of time, home in on what is intrinsically the right solution. And the problem is, in the time that I've been doing this working in this industry, I've seen fragmentation, and it's time that we turned it round and bring it back together and work as a team more than we ever did. Well, we certainly have done in the past 15 years. The other thing I'd like to say is that generally within Network Rail, our T1s and internally, and our consultants know all this, but maybe, and this is self-criticism really of the business, we don't involve T2s and T3s as much as we should. And I think if if we spend a little bit more money up front during optioneering, bringing in the T3s, T2s and T3s who would not normally have a place at the table, that might facilitate efficiency, which would result in everybody making money and the overall costs being less.
One or two wider issues, and Steve, interesting that you comment on tier 2s and tier 3s. If I reflect on membership of the Temporary Works Forum, which is approaching 200 companies now, we have started to see tier 2s joining and tier 3s, which is fantastic. What I don't see, maybe we should change our name. We have virtually no general consulting engineers, permanent works designers, very, very few. Now, is that because our name immediately thinks, well, temporary works, that's the contractor's problem? We have most of the big tier 1s, quite a lot of tier 2s, lots of specialists, some clients, proprietary suppliers, specialist designers, but actually very few of the larger general engineering consultancies. I think it'd be fantastic if a few people joined and they got a little bit of set up a little interest group within the Temporary Works Forum. Other issues for me on the wider things, education. It seems to be regular criticism still of what education of engineers, and particularly whether temporary works is something that people even want to consider doing. Is it? I think perhaps the unfashionable, I'll go and do temporary works, maybe that's beginning to break down a bit. Qualifications. I had somebody on the phone the other day bemoaning the fact that there is insufficient site experience of engineers on site in their qualification period to be able to understand how construction ticks. And I've got some sympathy with that, but then maybe I'm just looking through rose-tinted spectacles because I should be retiring now, and I'm look back at my site days. I had to do time on site. There was no alternative. And then CPD. Slowly but surely there is CPD becoming available specifically in temporary works, and something that's not particularly been there before. There have been pockets of real expertise, but perhaps across the board it's largely been in-house. So I think there's lots of in terms of permanent works designers, lots of challenges for the whole industry. I don't think it's just one issue.
Well, that was very disappointing as a group, guys. That was all collaborative, and all seem to be on the same page about the collaboration and education aspect of that. So we've had a question from Francis Quateng that builds into another theme of some that we've talked about and had lots of questions on during the webinar series, which is temporary works checking and reviews. So Francis asks, what are the panel's thoughts on a contractor moving forward to carrying out the construction of temporary works following its design by an external consultant without any in-house checks?
That's almost madness in my view. I would always preach that a contractor can go external for the expertise to design. We go to companies like Andon, and there's let's be honest, Angus, there's several companies similar to yours that specialise in the field of designing temporary works. If I was working for a tier 1 contractor, I would always want to do a sanity check of what you'd produced to see if I could build it on site. I wouldn't just, you sent me a drawing, I wouldn't just give the envelope to the foreman on site and say, there you go and build that, tell me when you're finished.
No. You've got to do your own sanity check, not just on the engineering behind it, but does it meet the brief? Does it fit where it's supposed to fit? There's so many things you've got to look at. Yeah. Even if you take the engineering away, you can't just go, right, this is coming the door, off you go. It just doesn't work.
Simple things, for example, you'll design up a load of equipment, it's heavy, it's going to turn up on the back of a lorry. How the hell do we offload it? Yeah. Where do we put it on the site? Where's our storage area for this?
Was the question? If the question was about about somebody taking on something that hasn't been checked. Isn't that negligent?
Well, you could argue that.
Yeah, the people providing the design should have checked that design, or
I think the question
was, I
think the question was the design's been checked is whether or not the contractor then should review what the designer has produced. I think that's what Francis is asking.
Yeah,
that's my understanding.
I think
the design being checked as a package. Sorry, Mark.
Yeah. So you turn up with a package.
You would think the temporary works coordinator would review it, or if they didn't have the skills, they would go through it with the site manager, for the site manager to look at the logistics of it and everything. But it wouldn't be a case of hand it over to the operatives to go and build.
Brilliant. So Francis, I've actually got Francis on the line here. Francis, does that answer your question?
Yes, it is. Morning, gentlemen.
Hello,
is,
Francis.
Hi there. It was actually that.
Oh, he's broken up.
Yeah, lost him.
I think we've lost Francis there. That's a shame, but I think that I'm going to take the positive from that he said yes. That kind of covered what he was asking. So
can you hear me?
Oh, there we go.
You're back.
Yes, I can hear you now.
You've gone again.
No, we're going to have to move on, unfortunately, Francis. But thanks so much for the question and being involved in the series. So my next question, it kind of follows on to this. It was a question that we talked about when we were building up for this, is review of calculations by third parties, i.e. a check, not a formal check, but a review. Does that add value?
Well, I'll go ahead. It depends on, to my point of view, it depends on the complexity of the scheme and what the design is for. But generally speaking, we issue calculations with our design packages still. Sometimes we don't, but most of the time it goes out the door with a set of calcs, and then it's often reviewed. It's to my point of view, it's making sure that the comments add value rather than, oh, there's a spelling mistake there or there's a comma there where it should be a full stop. That sort of thing is not really constructive. But a holistic review and maybe even doing your own fag packet calculations to satisfy yourself that it works, that makes perfect sense to me. Or showing constraints or considering things that the designer maybe didn't see, isn't aware of, or in some cases has never experienced before. All of that does add value, and understanding the logic behind the designer's analysis is also adds value, but typos doesn't add value and just stupid.
A design check shouldn't just be getting a set of calculations and going through them line by line and ticking if you've added those numbers correctly and you've worked out your bending moment correctly. It's more than that. You shouldn't really see the original calculations if you're doing a.
Well, that's what 5950 says.
Yeah.
Sorry, 5975 says that. Don't show them the calculations.
You shouldn't just sit there with a page of calcs and go tick 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 tick.
Sorry, Ray. I was talking here about similar to what Francis was saying. So if we've done a design in a Cat 2 or Cat 3 and we issue that to someone and they then review that whole package rather than the checking process is more.
Okay. Yeah. I know a lot of people aren't keen on issuing calculations. I must admit, I'm quite relaxed about that. If I've done some calcs and somebody's going to find value in them, if they want them, there you go. I'll email them to them. I've got no problems with emailing my calcs to people, providing they don't, use them as they're checking, when they go through the checking process. But if they want them, have them.
Yeah.
I think I might argue as well that calculations, as it sounds as if Angus is doing, calculations are part of pre-construction information. Mm. You've produced drawings or a BIM model, or you've got additional survey results or whatever, and you also have passed them. Why not pass them on? Mm. It's separate to have they been checked and how have they been checked. Obviously the recommendations in 5975 are fairly clear whether you agree with them or not, but I think sometimes having that information is extremely useful.
I think it's good CPD for young engineers. If you get a set of calcs carried out by somebody experienced in that field and you give it to somebody just starting off in the industry, it's a good way to learn, isn't it?
Yes.
Steve, did you have something you wanted
Yeah,
to say?
yeah. I could talk about this for hours, but I won't. The long and short of it is it can add value as long as it's done properly. If you're going to be there just to pick holes in calculations, that's absolutely the wrong thing to do. But I am an absolute advocate of another pair of eyes and ears at looking at things. And indeed, for instance, in assurance within Network Rail, we don't ask for calculations with the permanent works designs. We don't actually ask for them with the temporary works designs, but we get them because it's recommended in 5975 by and large. But the reason is that a lot of the times, the package of information that's been carefully done by the temporary works designer is within the scope that he's done that work. But there will be knock-on effects on other parts of the structure, for instance. So take, for instance, a huge scaffold that's tied in umpteen different places. It's typical that the scaffold designer will have designed the scaffold, but somebody else needs to take charge of making sure that the structure that you're bolting into is capable of taking the loads. And therefore, the provision of that information, which you need to do your design, so you should have done, so there's no problem in releasing it, is not there as a tool to be bashed about if you've made mistakes, because to err is human. Yeah, to me, the possible advantage of somebody spotting something and working in a collaborative environment to say, I'm not sure about this, mate. Ooh, this is a bit dodgy. It is an immense benefit to the industry as a whole, because it adds to the dissemination of lessons learned and good practice within the industry. So I'm a massive fan of provision of the right information. That's not to say that we need calculations with everything, but we need to see what we need to see, and that depends on the circumstances. Does that help?
Brilliant. Yeah, that's great. So I'm going to move on to a question by John Charles, who asks, a key issue on buildability is the production of CAD drawings and consultants' reluctance to print out drawings to see the whole picture and not just view the screen. Malachy, do you have any thoughts on this one?
Not certain exactly what he's asking, but I'm assuming that it is printing out of the CAD drawings.
I think it would be the idea of basically just viewing them on the screen and that value of having them printed out. Let's see if I can bring John in. Sorry. Hi,
Thank
John.
you. Good morning, Borada. My thing is that we've had a lot of get drawings in. The consultants have produced them on CAD. They've only just looked at the area of the drawing that's shown on the screen, and they're not taking a print and actually looking at the whole drawing. They're just concentrating on that little bit that they can see. And indeed, in many cases, when they printed out the full drawing, or when we've had the full drawing to look at, we can see the clashes of coordination issues. And by just spending that time looking at the whole picture, not just the A4 or the A3 size they see on the screen, can solve an awful lot of coordination issues.
Yeah, I would agree with you there. The other side of it is, prior to COVID, I used to check everything and print it, and it was all paper copies this and paper copies that, and it was a lot of, I just felt I could see things a bit more clearer when it was on a printed format rather than a screen. But we're all working from home now. You've got to do a checker roll electronically, and in that role, I've been doing everything on the screen since COVID kicked in. So I've had to adapt myself to the way I've been checking things. So in the past, I definitely would have printed out all the drawings just to get a feel for the project, but probably not as much now. And I see your point about engineers prior to sending it out, a print of and review of the entire drawing would be helpful to capture mistakes. I don't know.
Thank you, Steve.
I think I've seen a similar sort of problem with drawings coming out where the designer has ignored any of the constraints and they purely show on their drawings the item they've designed. And it's in a lot of cases, it's projects that have been done in Revit, I would say, where they're not modelling anything around the site. They're modelling purely their permanent work structure. And you might have a building right next to it, but it doesn't show in their section because they're not modelling that. It's not their scope to model anything outside what they themselves directly are designing, and that can have huge coordination issues. And I hate to say it, but a lot of the network rail schemes that we see coming through do just this. They focus on purely what's being new and what is being designed without any sort of thought or care as to what's around the site. Which, when you start overlaying it with topo surveys or models we've built, and you start seeing, well, hang on a minute, you've missed the fact there's a railway line there, or there's a building with a basement, or there's a building without a basement, or there's a wall there with a foundation that's 200 mil below the ground, and we're supposed to dig right in front of it. It's things like this where I'm seeing perhaps a decrease in the drawing standards, and people literally doing, right, this is what we're being paid to do, no more, no less.
So I'd like to say there that there's something going wrong then and we'll take that one offline, mate. But the long and short of it is it's absolutely impossible not to consider the entirety of the area in which you're working in when you're doing work on the railway, because of all the interfaces with many stakeholders, not just the railway. So if you're seeing projects that are little bubbles that don't take account of essential things on the railway and adjacent to the railway, then something's going wrong. And I'd like to know about that, because part of my job is to make sure that we improve.
Yeah. So is there perhaps a case to be made that someone somewhere has to produce, you could call it a drawing, but let's call it information that removes all the minutiae of the details and produces a global picture of what you're going to build to look at interfaces. Yeah. The question is where does that sort of responsibility lie? Can I throw in the words principal and designer?
Yeah, I think I agree with you, Ray. They're the ones
just throwing it out there.
Yeah, they should be looking
the global
at
picture.
Yeah.
CDM, PCI.
Part of their role is to manage all designs, and unless they've got that bird's eye view, that satellite view, whatever we're not looking at the nuts and bolts, how many M16 bolts you've got. We want the satellite view of the entire site. Who's looking at that?
Well, on the railway, constraints are the key drivers to how the permanent works and the temporary works design happen in many cases. So like I said at the start of this conversation, it's absolutely essential that you've got a full picture of the entirety of the surroundings to understand what you need to do.
Okay, great. That's a really interesting debate there. I'm going to move on to a question from Barnabas, who has asked, discussion already in this has been around PW designers and what they should consider. How would you drive change in the industry to ensure that clients are willing to pay higher fees for the design and think about the construction methodologies rather than being focused on reducing costs? I'm just going to see if we can bring Barnabas in as well. Hi, Barnabas.
How you going?
Good, we're good. So is that a fair, is there anything you'd like to add to that question, or should I hand it over to someone in the panel if they're...
Yeah, I mean, you can go ahead, but basically I heard a lot of views, and I'm on the view that, the industry has started to head down to a certain direction where, clients and perhaps in some instances head contractors said, I know how to build, I'm not going to pay you for that. So you just deal with permanent works design and we'll deal with the rest. But now that projects are getting somewhat more complex and the industry went down in one direction, how do you turn that around and make sure that everyone understands that, it's not really working well? And how do you make sure that clients understand it? Okay, if I pay a little bit more, I'm going to get a significantly greater value than running what we do at the moment.
Do you want me to start with that one?
Oh, you're the client, Steve.
Yeah, I agree. I can't say anything else. It's absolutely imperative that we do the right things. And your comment was, it might have been construed as D&B contractors saying, Mr. Consultant, thanks for your design, we'll take it from here. Well, I see that, unfortunately. And I know of various jobs that could have resulted in multi-fatalities as a direct consequence of tier 1 contractors saying, we'll take it from here, mate. Even though the drawing says geotechnical, experienced geotechnical engineering needs to be on site to monitor excavations in embankments, that didn't happen. And the consequences could have been disastrous. And I'll quote the words Bradwell Abbey if anybody wants to find out more. So I am a huge fan of making sure the right people are in the right places at the right time to make the right decisions. And that might mean contractors saying, actually, we will bring the engineer in to have a look. And the engineer would rock up on site and go, hold on a minute, that's not what I designed. And he'll be another pair of eyes and ears who will look at something, and that is not in a way in which he's going to then get a bashing because he's being paid by the contractor. It's a way in which he's going to go to the contractor and say, look at this. And the contractor's actually going to say, oh, thank goodness I brought you along here. That's going to save us a couple of million quid because this could have gone very, very badly wrong. So I do believe that the industry needs to recognise that getting the right people in the right place at the right time is vital for safe designs and safe execution of works. And the industry should be recognising that. Take, for instance, read about Edinburgh schools. A little bit of supervision in Edinburgh schools, and we wouldn't have had the disaster that's manifested itself in Edinburgh schools. Just Google it, and you'll see what I mean. DC1 as well. There's so many things that are nothing to do with rail that we as an industry, the construction industry, can learn from, so that we don't make those same mistakes again. And the industry is too fragmented and it needs to bring itself back together. I'm now going to shut up. What do the people?
Steve, these issues have been around for years, haven't they?
Yeah, it's like a new generation of the same thing, isn't it?
We get report after report, and the message of early contractor involvement, or whatever you want to call it, because there are variants on that name, but that's been around for ages. So why don't we get it? Why don't clients get it? Or if clients do get it, what are we not doing right as designers, as contractors? I don't quite know the answer, but it seems to me that we're very much in need of an industry-wide debate.
I throw in a thought, a question. I don't know if I really know the answer to this, but it's a thought. Ultimately, the client ends up paying for temporary works. They may not know they're paying for temporary works, but ultimately it's part of the deal. On how many projects would temporary works be listed as a separate costing exercise and presented to the client? Now, on a lot of jobs, the cost of temporary works would be a very, very significant percentage of the overall cost of the project. Now, the job at New Street, I don't know if you guys have got any sort of gut feeling for figures. What percentage of New Street was temporary works in terms of cost?
I couldn't give you a percentage, but it was very significant.
We're looking at big numbers here, aren't we?
Oh, multi-millions, yeah.
Yeah, we're not looking at tens of thousands of pounds. Job. So maybe if temporary works were listed as a separate entity and presented to the client, and the client looks at it and says, well, hang on a minute, of this building, of this structure, which is 100 million, 20 million of that is going on temporary works, and it may well be the single biggest item on that bill. Maybe it focuses the client's mind on what they're actually spending it on, and they think, well, maybe if we spend a little bit more money on, be it sort of surveys or ability, we could make a big difference to that particular figure.
Right, I'm gonna have to jump in now. I think we've cracked it, guys. We've had an hour. We've fixed temporary works, and we know where we are. But yeah, unfortunately, we have run out of time. I think it's been a really interesting conversation. I think we could have been talking for another couple of hours just to cover the questions. So I'm sure myself and Angus will be in touch to see if we can do something similar in the future, as there's lots of topics of the list I have. There's lots of things we haven't even got to discuss today, and there's lots of questions unfortunately we haven't got to. But I just wanted to take a moment to thank David, Ray, Steve, Malachy and Angus for taking the time to answer all of our questions. I'd like to thank the audience who've joined us. Some people have joined us every week over the last 10 weeks. It's I know Angus will be happy that he's not having to write a presentation every week. But yeah, I just wanted to take the opportunity to thank you. And yeah, Angus, do you want to close off? Yeah, with just the final thought, and and I'll end the call.
Yep, just thank everybody who's taken part, people who've asked questions, people who've given us answers, people who've been there while we've been chatting away to ourselves on a Friday afternoon, or Friday morning, sorry. It might be the end of the weekly series, but we will be back on a monthly basis, and I can definitely see an opportunity to do something similar to this again in the future, because as Christian said, we've still got racks of questions that we haven't even touched on yet. So we'll figure something out, but for now, thank you all for listening and taking part in all of this, and we'll see you soon.
Fantastic. Thanks, everyone. Goodbye.
Bye. Cheers.